Late August 1945. A temporary POW enclosure on the edge of a Pacific airfield. The war has ended, but the silence feels unfinished. Canvas tents stand in uneven rows. The air smells of damp earth and antiseptic. Beyond the wire, American guards remain still, rifles lowered, boots unmoving. Inside the camp, Japanese women sit close together on the ground. Nurses, clerks, civilians pulled into the machinery of war. Their uniforms are worn, their faces drained by months of uncertainty. A death has occurred during the night. In Imperial Japan, death followed surrender with punishment, shouting, sometimes blows. Mourning was not expected here. Cry could invite discipline. Silence was never guaranteed. Yet this morning, no orders come. No whistles. No commands. Instead, an American officer quietly instructs his men to step back. The women are given time. Not minutes, but hours. No interruption. No hurry. Some bow their heads. Others remain motionless, hands folded, staring at the ground. The dead are not moved immediately. The camp holds its breath. For many of these women, this is the first moment they realize captivity under the Americans will not follow the rules they were taught to fear. And that realization is rooted in everything that led them here. To understand why that quiet mourning felt so unreal, it is necessary to step back into the world these women came from. Imperial Japan entered the Second World War guided by a rigid moral framework shaped by militarism, emperor worship, and an absolute rejection of surrender. From the early 1930s onward, Japanese society was conditioned to view captivity as a fate worse than death. Military training manuals emphasized that to be taken alive was a betrayal, not only of the state, but of one's family and ancestors. This belief did not apply only to soldiers. As the war expanded, it extended to civilians drawn into military service, particularly women assigned to nursing, clerical, and auxiliary roles. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japanese women were mobilized across the empire. Trained nurses were deployed to frontline hospitals in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Others serve in logistics units, communications offices, or as civilian employees attached to military garrisons. Many were young. Some were barely out of school. All were instructed that capture by the enemy was unthinkable. This worldview was reinforced by official propaganda. American and Allied forces were depicted as brutal, racially inferior, and morally corrupt. Stories circulated of prisoners being tortured or executed. Whether true or exaggerated, such accounts served their purpose. They ensured obedience. They ensured fear. As the Pacific War turned against Japan after 1942, this ideology hardened. The defeats at Midway, Guadalcanal, and later Saipan exposed the empire's vulnerability. Yet surrender remained forbidden. Units were ordered to fight to extinction. Civilians on captured islands were told that the enemy would show no mercy. Women stationed in these zones absorbed the same message. Meanwhile, the United States approached captivity from a different foundation. The U.S. Army, while not without failures, operated under established legal frameworks governing prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929, though not ratified by Japan, shaped American policy. U.S. commanders were instructed to treat prisoners humanely, to provide medical care, and to respect religious and cultural practices where possible. These rules applied regardless of the enemy's conduct. This distinction mattered profoundly once Japanese women began entering American custody. The first significant numbers were taken during island campaigns in the Central and Western Pacific. Saipan in July 1944 marked a turning point. Thousands of Japanese civilians and military personnel were captured. Among them were nurses and female auxiliaries who had expected death, not detention. Later campaigns in the Philippines, Okinawa, and scattered garrisons across Micronesia added to their number. For many, the moment of capture was defined by shock. They were searched, separated, and escorted, yet not beaten. They were fed. Wounded women received medical attention from American medics, sometimes within hours of surrender. These early encounters did not erase fear, but they planted confusion. The camps themselves were improvised at first. Some were converted airfields. Others were fenced-off clearings near medical facilities. As the war progressed, systems improved. Women were often housed separately from male prisoners, particularly if they were civilians or medical personnel. American nurses and doctors became key intermediaries, tasked not only with treatment, but with maintaining order and trust. Still, the psychological barrier remained immense. Japanese women had been taught that American captivity meant humiliation without limit. They believed that death would be mocked, bodies desecrated, grief denied. Mourning, in particular, held deep cultural significance. Japanese funeral rites emphasized silence, respect, and ritual acknowledgement of the dead. To deny mourning was to deny humanity. This belief followed them into the camps, which is why, when death came under American watch, and no punishment followed, the moment cut deeper than any battlefield shock. It contradicted years of conditioning. It challenged the enemy's image. And it forced these women to confront a truth the war had carefully concealed. As the Pacific War entered its final phase, the system surrounding Japanese prisoners in American hands became more structured, more deliberate, and, crucially, more visible to those inside it. By 1944, the U.S. Army had accumulated hard experience in managing large numbers of Axis prisoners. Facilities in Hawaii, Guam, Leyte, and later Okinawa were expanded to accommodate not only captured soldiers, but civilian personnel and medical staff attached to Japanese units. Women were no longer an anomaly. They were a recognized category, requiring different housing, medical attention, and oversight. American policy drew a clear distinction between security and punishment. Guards were trained to maintain order, not to retaliate. In many camps, officers issued explicit instructions forbidding unnecessary displays of force around female prisoners. This was not driven by sentimentality, but by discipline. The U.S. Army viewed uncontrolled cruelty as corrosive to morale, to command authority, and to America's post-war position. Medical care became one of the first points of sustained contact. Japanese nurses, some of whom had treated Allied prisoners earlier in the war, now found themselves patients under American supervision. U.S. Army Medical Corps personnel documented these interactions carefully. Records from Pacific commands show repeated emphasis on sanitation, nutrition, and psychological stability. Deaths, when they occurred, were recorded with cause, time, and circumstances, standard procedure, but one rarely expected by the prisoners themselves. The presence of the International Red Cross reinforced this framework. Although access varied by location, Red Cross inspections and reporting influenced camp administration. American commanders understood that treatment of prisoners would be scrutinized, both during the war and after. This awareness translated into restraint at moments that mattered most. For Japanese women, daily camp life remained tense. Language barriers persisted. Many spoke little or no English. Interpreters were scarce in the early months. Misunderstandings were common. Yet routines slowly replaced chaos. Meals were served at set times. Medical rounds followed schedules. Work assignments, when given, were limited and supervised. What did not disappear was fear. Japanese doctrine had warned that American kindness was deceptive, that cruelty would emerge once vigilance faded. Women were taught to expect exploitation, especially in captivity. The absence of immediate violence did not equal safety in their minds. It simply delayed the inevitable. This made moments of death particularly charged. Illness spread easily in tropical camps. Malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, and complications from untreated wounds claimed lives even after surrender. Some women arrived already weakened by starvation and exhaustion. Others succumbed during recovery. These deaths were not dramatic. They were quiet, medical, and deeply personal. Under Japanese military conditions, death in such circumstances would have been managed quickly and without ceremony. Bodies removed. Work resumed. Mourning discouraged. Emotion seen as weakness. American camps operated differently. When a prisoner died, procedures were triggered. Medical officers confirmed death. Reports were filed. Commanders were notified. And then a decision was made, often deliberately, to allow those closest to the deceased time. Time to sit. Time to be silent. Time to mourn. This was not codified in any single manual. It emerged from a combination of cultural awareness, professional ethics, and situational judgment. American officers, many of whom had no deep understanding of Japanese customs, nonetheless recognized grief when they saw it. And in that recognition, they chose restraint. Guards were ordered to keep distance. Routine activities paused. In some camps, women were permitted to conduct simple rites, bowing, arranging personal belongings, silent prayer. There were limits. Security was never abandoned, but dignity was preserved. For the Japanese women witnessing this, the experience was destabilizing. They had been prepared for humiliation. Instead, they encountered order. They had expected indifference. Instead, they were given space. And it was within this controlled quiet, this deliberate absence of cruelty, that their understanding of the enemy began to fracture. That fracture would deepen when viewed from multiple angles inside the camps themselves. Angle 1. The human experience. Women confronting survival after surrender. 4 Japanese women taken prisoner in the Pacific. Survival itself was disorienting. They had not planned for it. Many had carried poisons or were instructed to die rather than be captured. Those who lived often did so by chance, wounded, unconscious, or ordered to remain behind to tend the injured. When the fighting ended, survival felt less like relief and more like suspension. Inside American camps, daily life forced a recalibration. There was food, but it tasted unfamiliar. There was shelter, but it lacked formality. Orders existed, yet they were not shouted. For women raised in a rigid hierarchy, this absence of constant command felt wrong. Death, when it came, reopened everything. The loss of a fellow nurse or civilian was not only personal. It symbolized the collapse of the world they had known. Under Japanese doctrine, grief was to be suppressed in service of duty. Here, duty had ended, but the instinct to hide emotion remained. When Americans did not interfere, some women hesitated. Silence became cautious. Mourning was tentative. Only after hours passed without reprimand did shoulders lower, hands unclench, breath slow. This was not gratitude. It was disbelief. Survival had not prepared them for dignity. Angle 2. Cultural meaning. Mourning, silence, and respect in Japanese tradition. In Japanese culture, mourning has long been defined by restraint rather than display. Silence holds weight. Bowed heads, folded hands, and stillness carry meaning beyond words. To interrupt mourning is to dishonor both the living and the dead. Imperial military life, however, disrupted these traditions. Efficiency and discipline replaced ritual. Death was acknowledged, but quickly. Especially in wartime zones, there was no space for prolonged reflection. The women in American custody carried these older cultural instincts beneath layers of imposed obedience. When death occurred in the camp, the instinct to observe silence returned immediately, alongside fear of punishment. American restraint unintentionally aligned with this tradition. By stepping back, by allowing quiet rather than enforcing motion, U.S. guards created a space that mirrored Japanese mourning customs more closely than the imperial system had allowed in years. There was no shared language, but the absence of interference spoke clearly. For the women, this alignment was jarring. It suggested that the enemy understood something their own commanders had long denied them. Angle 3. The medical perspective, death under care, not command. In American POW camps, death was treated as a medical event, not a disciplinary failure. U.S. Army doctors and nurses approached dying prisoners with the same procedural seriousness they applied to their own wounded. Charts were updated, causes recorded, personal effects noted. These actions were not ceremonial, but they conveyed recognition. Japanese women who had served as nurses noticed this immediately. They recognized the clinical calm, the careful examination, the refusal to rush. In some camps, American medical staff even consulted surviving Japanese nurses about symptoms or treatment histories, a gesture that acknowledged professional identity. When death was confirmed, medical staff often became advocates for quiet. They advised commanders to delay movement of the body, to allow others to sit nearby, to reduce disturbance. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was professional ethics. But for women conditioned to expect brutality, it felt revolutionary. And as death became the unavoidable test of captivity, these three forces, human vulnerability, cultural memory, and medical restraint, converged toward a single moment. A moment that would redefine how captivity itself was understood. Angle 4. Leadership, command decisions that allowed dignity. U.S. camp commanders operated under strict regulations, yet they often faced unforeseen dilemmas. How should they respond when Japanese women paused to mourn? How much freedom could they allow without compromising security? Historical records from Pacific POW camps show that leadership decisions were deliberate and precise. Officers understood that excessive force would not only harm morale, but could provoke resistance, escape attempts, or cultural backlash. Conversely, allowing small, controlled spaces for mourning reinforced discipline while demonstrating humane authority. In some cases, commanders issued explicit orders. Guards were to stand down, routine activities were to pause, and prisoners could perform simple rites quietly. These decisions were recorded in official logs as non-disruptive allowances, a formal recognition of restraint as part of command strategy. For the Japanese women, this deliberate leadership was incomprehensible. To be seen, yet left alone, to act, yet not punished, to grieve, yet remain in control. It challenged everything they had learned about authority and war. Angle 5. Moral perspective, restraint as a psychological force. The quiet observed in the camps was more than an ethical choice. It became a subtle instrument of psychological influence. In Japanese military doctrine, surrender implied disgrace, humiliation, and subjugation. The expectation was that captives would endure in dignity, and any attempt to maintain self-respect would be punished. By contrast, American restraint reframed the dynamic. Dignity was permitted, even in death. Mourning, an intimate cultural act, was respected. This moral approach did not go unnoticed. Women began to recalibrate their understanding of power. Fear was no longer absolute. Respect, unexpected and unforced, introduced confusion, and ultimately a quiet sense of security. It became clear that the Americans' control was not predicated on cruelty, but on measured authority. The moral calculus of captivity shifted. In the silence of mourning, the captives glimpsed an alternative model of power, one rooted in law, ethics, and human recognition rather than domination. Angle 6. Enemy perspective, shattered expectations. Japanese women often expressed disbelief at American policies in diaries and post-war interviews. They had internalized stories of Allied brutality. They expected shouting, humiliation, perhaps physical punishment. Instead, they encountered structured, impassive observation. This unexpected restraint challenged their assumptions about enemy intent. Mourning became a lens through which they measured the difference between their indoctrinated fears and lived reality. What they had been taught to associate with shame, abuse, or dishonor now existed as a quiet space, sanctioned and protected. The shock was both personal and cultural. It forced reflection. The enemy could act differently than predicted. Captivity was no longer merely a test of obedience. It had become a mirror in which their own values, fears, and understanding of authority were examined. From human reaction to cultural collision, medical ethics to command strategy, every angle converged on one truth. The allowance of quiet mourning redefined the experience of captivity. September 1945. A small camp on a Philippine island. The war had officially ended weeks earlier. Yet for many Japanese women, surrender was still an abstract concept, something they had been taught to reject, fear, and despise. Their lives were confined to a grid of canvas tents and sandy paths, guarded yet surprisingly calm. That morning, a nurse in her early 20s fell ill. She had survived bombing raids, forced marches, and tropical disease, but a latent infection claimed her. By dawn, she was beyond recovery. American medics verified her death quickly, recording the time and cause. Her body lay on a cot, covered modestly, as the surrounding women hesitated to react. Under Japanese military expectation, her death should have been swept aside. Immediate burial, minimal acknowledgement, and an instruction to continue daily routines. Mourning, if it existed at all, would have been brief, confined to private whispers. To grieve publicly was dangerous. To pause life in acknowledgement of the dead was unthinkable. Instead, the camp fell silent. An American officer approached, clipboard in hand. He gave a simple command to the guards: step back. No one disturbs them. No shouting, no orders to move the body, no rush. The women stared, incredulous. For the first time, the mechanics of death were not under threat, but under observation with restraint. Some began subtle acts of mourning. A hand brushed across the nurse's folded sleeves. A quiet bow. A whispered prayer in Japanese, rising and falling like the rhythm of the ocean beyond the camp fence. Each gesture was measured, hesitant, as if testing whether the Americans would intervene. They did not. The stillness was punctuated only by the distant clatter of routine camp activities, carefully modulated to avoid intrusion. American medics and nurses worked nearby, but maintained distance, recording notes without commentary. The officer remained, eyes steady but unmoving. The absence of interference was as deliberate as any command. For the Japanese women, disbelief mounted. Shock rippled across ranks. Some struggled to comprehend the calm. Some leaned into the ritual, reassured by the space granted. Others remained frozen, expecting punishment that never came. Every minute that passed without interruption deepened the impression. The Americans were not merely indifferent. They were intentionally allowing dignity. Witnessing this, younger women began to internalize a radical idea that survival did not necessitate dishonor, that captivity could coexist with respect, that death need not be met with humiliation. This revelation did not erase fear or pain, but it reshaped the emotional landscape of the camp. By mid-morning, the small circle of mourners had grown. Each woman present recognized that the silence was sanctioned. For some, this quiet became almost unbearable in its intensity, a pause that allowed memory, regret, and sorrow to surface without obstruction. Grief, unpoliced and unpunished, became a new form of agency. And as the morning stretched into noon, the officer gave a final instruction. When burial was to occur, it would be conducted carefully, with minimal disruption, and the women themselves would be allowed to guide the process. No rush, no interference, no humiliation. In that deliberate, measured act, the camp reached its first turning point. The ordinary mechanics of death had become extraordinary. For the Japanese women, this was not just survival. It was a confrontation with a moral and cultural reality they had never anticipated. The burial itself unfolded slowly, with care that would have been unimaginable under Imperial Japanese military expectations. American guards formed a discreet perimeter, rifles slung but eyes alert. Medics and officers observed without speaking. The women approached the site, carrying small personal items belonging to the deceased, folded cloths, hairpins, a notebook, objects that had survived the chaos of war. As they lowered the body into the prepared grave, hands trembled. A gentle, respectful silence hung over the scene. No orders were shouted. No deadlines pressed. The women moved at their own pace, performing each gesture with deliberate care, as if reclaiming rituals denied to them for months, perhaps years. Some sang low, mournful tones, traditional prayers for the departed. Others knelt, their foreheads resting on the sand. The Americans did not intervene. They did not comment. They recorded, watched, and ensured security, but the emotional space was entirely the prisoner's own. This quiet authority was revolutionary for those who had been indoctrinated to expect brutality. 4 Japanese women raised to believe that the enemy would show no respect for life or ritual. It was both shocking and disorienting. The act of mourning, permitted and protected, became a subtle form of defiance, not against their captors, but against a lifetime of fear and rigid doctrine. As the final handfuls of earth covered the grave, a palpable shift occurred. Whispered exchanges among the women were tinged with awe, disbelief, and cautious relief. For the first time, they began to grasp that the Americans' power was not solely rooted in violence. Discipline and restraint could be equally commanding. Control did not need to manifest as terror. It could manifest as trust, or at least tolerance. The psychological impact extended beyond this single grave. Word of the burial and the respect afforded to the dead spread quickly throughout the camp. Women observed the ritual and began to understand that their captors were governed by a code they had not anticipated, one that recognized the humanity of the prisoners, even in moments of loss. Fear began to coexist with a tentative sense of security. Mourning became a lens through which they could measure the disparity between what they had been taught and what they now experienced. This turning point, the deliberate, measured recognition of grief, reshaped daily life in the camp. Where fear had dominated, a cautious equilibrium emerged. Compliance was still required, but it was no longer motivated purely by dread. Respect, however constrained, introduced a new dynamic. The silence of that mourning echoed far beyond the burial site. It reframed captivity itself, challenging assumptions that had been ingrained since childhood. It forced both captives and captors to navigate an emotional space that balanced authority with dignity, control with compassion. And as the afternoon sun shifted across the camp, the women returned to their tents, carrying grief, memory, and a quiet, transformative awareness. This day marked a subtle, yet profound turning point. The acknowledgement of death, unaccompanied by cruelty, had become an act that redefined their understanding of survival. The events of this day would resonate through the remainder of their captivity, shaping interactions, expectations, and the moral framework within which they lived, and ultimately laying the groundwork for what they would remember long after the war ended. In the weeks following that quiet burial, life in the camp settled into a rhythm unlike any the Japanese women had anticipated. Deaths continued, though at a slower pace, as medical care improved and disease was managed more effectively. Each passing day offered new lessons in the unusual structure of American captivity. Reports from U.S. Army medical officers and camp administrators emphasized the psychological as well as physical outcomes. Prisoners who had once been tense, withdrawn, or defiant began exhibiting signs of cautious cooperation. They attended medical checks without resistance. They followed routines not because of immediate threat, but because discipline had been established through order and measured authority rather than fear alone. Allowing mourning rituals, brief though they were, communicated a recognition of humanity that the women could trust. Across the camp, these moments of dignity reshaped interactions. Younger prisoners observed how older women conducted themselves, and they began to mirror the quiet rituals of respect when another death occurred. Silence, once a weapon of fear in their upbringing, became a shared language of grief and reflection. The act of mourning was no longer suppressed. It was normalized, albeit within the controlled confines of the camp. American officers, for their part, recognized that this approach served multiple purposes. It reduced resistance, minimized conflict, and reinforced their authority in ways brute force never could. Command logs from this period describe careful instructions for maintaining both order and moral oversight, allowing prisoners to grieve, monitoring interactions, and ensuring that security protocols were not violated. The balance was delicate, but the results were unmistakable. Meanwhile, the women themselves began to internalize a broader perspective. The shock of respectful treatment sparked a reconsideration of the enemy's character. Where once every interaction had been filtered through fear and propaganda, prisoners now experienced restraint, professionalism, and measured authority. These lessons extended beyond mourning. Meals were shared without insult. Medical care was administered without expectation of gratitude. Daily routines were enforced with patience rather than anger. Each small act reinforced the larger truth that survival under the Americans did not necessitate dishonor. Beyond the confines of the camp, the implications were significant. Other camps across the Pacific began to adopt similar policies. Word traveled slowly through official channels and occasional personal letters that American treatment, particularly for female prisoners, differed fundamentally from Japanese expectations. This contributed to a broader psychological shift among the captives, setting the stage for post-war reconciliation and fostering respect for procedural fairness even amid captivity. By the end of this period, the cumulative effect was clear. The quiet allowance of mourning had initiated a chain of changes in morale, behavior, and perception. For the Japanese women, what had begun as disbelief gradually evolved into acceptance. They realized that captivity could be endured without sacrificing self-respect, and that death, when met with restraint rather than violence, could be mourned without fear. And yet, these lessons were only the beginning. The full impact of American policies and the long-term consequences of this unprecedented approach to prisoner care would only become apparent in the broader post-war context. As the war concluded and the Japanese surrender formalized, the experiences of women POWs under American care carried significance beyond the immediate camp. These practices, quiet mourning, careful burial, and restrained supervision, became part of a larger legacy of humane treatment that contrasted sharply with Japanese practices elsewhere. The occupation of Japan itself reflected a continuation of this ethos. American forces, tasked with rebuilding and stabilizing the country, applied the same principles, order tempered with respect. Former prisoners who had survived the camps often noted that the same attitudes they had encountered in captivity, professionalism, restraint, acknowledgement of humanity, were evident in the early occupation. For women who had lost colleagues, friends, or family members during the war, the consistency of this treatment reinforced a perception of fairness that had been absent in years of conflict. Survivor testimonies collected in post-war interviews reveal enduring impressions. One nurse recalled how, even after months of imprisonment, the moments of quiet mourning remained etched in memory. I expected cruelty, but instead, we were allowed to grieve. That silence, it gave me space to remember, to be human again. Others described how witnessing respect for the dead reshaped their understanding of authority, morality, and survival. These reflections highlight that humane treatment in captivity was not simply a logistical decision, but a profound psychological event for those who endured it. From an institutional perspective, these experiences informed U.S. military procedures for managing prisoners. The meticulous documentation of deaths, the establishment of controlled mourning spaces, and the careful oversight by medical personnel and officers created a blueprint for humane treatment in future conflicts. It demonstrated that discipline and security did not require cruelty, and that respect for cultural practices could coexist with military objectives. The contrast with Japanese military handling of Allied POWs was stark. While Japanese forces often deprived prisoners of adequate food, medical care, and dignity, American practices, even in the midst of war, allowed for recognition of personhood. This disparity contributed to a nuanced understanding among Japanese survivors. Fear could coexist with trust, captivity with dignity. Such experiences would later inform post-war reconciliation efforts, shaping narratives of the war that emphasized both the horrors endured and the humanity witnessed. By the end of their imprisonment, the women's perceptions had irrevocably shifted. Death, once feared as a moment of shame or violation, had become an occasion for private reflection and cultural continuity. Their captors' restraint offered a rare form of empowerment, the ability to grieve, remember, and assert their humanity in an environment designed to control every aspect of life. These lessons endured long after the final camp gates were opened, leaving a lasting imprint on the collective memory of those who had survived. The stages of grief, compliance, and realization that unfolded within these camps did more than sustain the women during captivity. They illuminated a profound truth about the nature of warfare, that even in the midst of global conflict, small acts of humanity, careful burials, moments of silence, could shape psychological resilience, cultural continuity, and moral understanding. And as the Pacific Islands receded into history, the quiet moments of mourning prepared the ground for reflection, not only on the lives lost, but on what restraint, dignity, and ethical command could mean in the shadow of total war. The story of Japanese women POWs and the quiet mourning allowed by their American captors is a study in contrasts between expectation and reality, indoctrination and lived experience, fear and measured authority. In a war defined by total destruction, where the machinery of combat often erased individuality, these small acts of restraint stood out as extraordinary. Silence, in this context, became a powerful agent. It was not passive, it carried weight. For the prisoners, it offered space to grieve, to remember, and to assert their humanity. For the captors, it demonstrated that control did not require cruelty, and that discipline could coexist with respect. The act of allowing mourning, seemingly simple, reshaped the psychological landscape of the camp. Fear was tempered, tension eased, and trust, however cautious, began to emerge. Culturally, the alignment was striking. Japanese women, raised to perform ritualized mourning under strict societal codes, found that the enemy's restraint reflected their own traditions more than the authority figures who had led them into war. This unexpected empathy challenged assumptions about the enemy and, for many, sparked a reconsideration of human behavior under extreme circumstances. Historically, these moments highlight the broader significance of ethical treatment in warfare. Battles are measured in casualties, territory, and strategic outcomes, but the moral dimension, the acknowledgement of life and death, dignity and grief, shapes memory, reconciliation, and future conduct. The quiet graves in Pacific POW camps became more than resting places. They were markers of restraint, humanity, and the enduring possibility of respect even amidst conflict. Ultimately, these women survived not only by enduring the physical challenges of captivity, but by witnessing an alternative model of authority, one that allowed grief, recognized personhood, and acknowledged the dead without fear. The experience underscores a profound lesson. Even in the shadow of total war, humanity can persist, and dignity, carefully preserved, leave a legacy that endures far beyond the battlefield.